What is the closing date in a funding transaction, and what is a rolling closing date? Well, to start with, a closing date is simply the date in which you consummate the transaction at hand. And in this scenario, investors are providing capital to a startup venture in exchange for an ownership interest. This is the date at which the parties are going to effectuate that exchange. The funding from the investor is going to come through to the startup, and the startup is going to provide or document an ownership interest for the investors in the company. Now, generally, the board of directors will approve the closing date. That is, they specifically do it through an approved resolution and a directive to the executive to consummate the transaction on a given day. Now, in some scenarios, you do have a rolling closing date. This is generally only common in early round, seed round funding, because seed rounds or early fundings often involved multiple investors to meet the investment target. That is, you're accepting promises or subscriptions to the investment from numerous investors to try to get a pool together to meet the funding requirement of the startup venture. This is generally not the case with later rounds like a Series A, B, or C round, because generally there you have one firm, a venture capital firm, that's providing all of the capital that's going to fund the startup venture. So what does it mean for the closing date to be rolling during seed rounds? Well, because you are acquiring additional investors along and along to meet the funding requirements of the startup, you generally set a end date at which the funding round will close. But until that time, anyone who subscribes to the funding round, any investor who commits to be part of the funding round, they are obligated. So they have to actually provide their promised capital in exchange for an ownership interest or percentage of ownership as agreed to by the parties along and along. So early on, if a firm's going to raise $1 million and early investors pledge $100,000, well, they are now obligated and they have to turn over that $100,000 as part of the agreement, regardless of whether the company reaches its funding target or no. Now, there are provisions in the agreement or the subscription agreement between the company and the investors that says, hey, they can walk away if the company doesn't meet its funding targets. But absent a provision like that, with a rolling closing date, again, you are committed from the very beginning. Early investors really hate this. They prefer a fixed closing date, but oftentimes in seed rounds where you really are cobbling together investors from different corners, it's really important that a startup follow this procedure and allow a rolling closing date, because once you commit one investor, it makes it easier or more likely that you can bring on subsequent investors because you already have money in the pot towards the funding round. So this is what a closing date is, and this is what a rolling closing date is, and why it's important in the funding scenario.